Good to see you. My name is Monique Pryor. I am the executive director of the Free Library Foundation. I'm coming back home to Philadelphia. I've been on the job a month and a half, and I was born and raised in Philadelphia, but I haven't been living here in over 30 years. So it's so great to be back home near family and friends. So thank you. Philadelphia is amazing, amazing. Go Eagles, that's right, go Eagles. Philly is amazing. I'm so excited that we have a sold out crowd today. I want to say hello to the people who are in the simulcast rooms. Thank you for coming here. And thank you for your ongoing support of the library's mission to advance literacy, guide learning, and inspire curiosity. It is my pleasure to welcome on stage my friend, Rashida Jones. She is the president of MSNBC and the first African-American woman to run a major cable news network. Let's give a round of applause for that. Rashida, yes. Rashida will be introducing Rachel Maddow today, but not only is she the president of MSNBC, Judge Hughes, where's Judge Hughes? She is a new member, along with Judge Ketanji Brown and Deborah Lee of BET, of the illustrious sorority of Delta Sigma Theta. So she is your sorority sister. Rashida and I bonded on busy working mothers. I love friends who share their friends, so we have a mutual friend who introduced us. But she finds time to give back to the community. She doesn't have to be here today. She's here as a favor to me because you know with what's going on in the news today, right, which is sad, and we pray for everyone in the Middle East. She has a big job on her hands, but she's here to be with us today, to take a moment away. So let's thank her for that. She makes time for young people giving back. And I know I'm getting this wrong, Rashida, but one of the first jobs she had to do, she was told shortly before, around January 5th, in 2021, that she just had to cover and make reign over the Electoral College confirmations. And we know how that turned out to be. So one of her first jobs in the role was actually a big one. And she's just been amazing, speaking to my students at my former college. But once again, let me welcome to the stage my friend who's here for you and Rachel Maddow. Give Rashida Jones a round of applause.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you. It's wonderful to see so many people come out for what is the first stop in this book tour. I'm very excited that the first stop is here in Philadelphia, here in Pennsylvania. My parents are from Philadelphia. My grandmother's house is a few miles away. I was born in York, Pennsylvania, and so starting here is just special. I want to thank the Free Library of Philadelphia for hosting this. What an incredible crowd. You mentioned sold out, and it's just great to see so many people interested in what Rachel has to say. I'm also very excited to do this at a time where we're celebrating 15 years of the Rachel Maddow Show. 15 years of incredibly smart insight, 15 years of top-tier journalism, 15 years of setting the standard, and I could not be more proud to celebrate that with Rachel. I'm excited for you guys to hear more about Prequel and just kind of hear how it all came together. I won't give away too much of the origin story, but it actually started through some of the research she did for the Ultra podcast. And if you've heard Ultra, and I know a lot of people have listened to Ultra, it's very different. Thank you. It's excellent. It's all Rachel. It's very different, but it ties in that same deep storytelling and those moments where you're listening and there's part of your brain that's like, is this real? And then the other part is like, I can't believe this is real. We're lucky to get a glimpse of that with Rachel and Julian Zelizer. Excited to hear the two of them together. Excited to hear not only some of the book, which you'll get to hear, but how this all came together. I won't delay this anymore because I know who you're here to see. Please welcome the incomparable Rachel Maddow.
Thank you so, so much. It is a real blessing to have a boss who, A, is as supportive and good at her job as Rashida is, but also somebody who lets a person do work like this. That is not a given. And when I went through a little bit of a change in my schedule and in my life at MSNBC, it was Rashida who reconceptualized a life where I could still be doing the news stuff that I'm doing, but also have space to think longer thoughts and say longer things. And that is, I want to live up to your confidence in me, boss. So thank you very much. All right. I'm really nervous. When I do a TV show, I can't see you. So, yeah, I'll calm down as I get going. I've taken as my inspiration for this book tour, and this is my first event in the book tour, this beautiful moment in the first Democratic debate in 2008, Democratic presidential debate. Brian Williams was moderator, and he said to candidate Joe Biden, Senator, given what's been described as your uncontrolled verbosity, can you reassure voters in this country that you would have the discipline you would need on the world stage? And Joe Biden said, yes. And then stopped talking and didn't say. So I'm taking that as my inspiration. I'm not going to talk too much. I'm really looking forward to speaking with Professor Julian Zelizer about this, and I don't want to take up too much of that time. And I'm really nervous. But I'm going to read just a little bit. And then we'll jump in. He was one of the most successful and celebrated industrialists on the planet. His anti-Semitism was also rank and unchecked. He spewed it freely in private tirades among friends, family, close business cohorts, newspaper reporters, or pretty much anybody within earshot. He lectured his sometimes weary auditors in the Ford Motor Company, in private chats, in interviews, at dinners, even on camping trips. A close friend wrote in his diary after witnessing one late-night round-the-campfire diatribe that Ford, quote, attributes all evil to Jews or to the Jewish capitalists. Ford even ordered his engineers to forgo the use of any brass in his Model T automobiles, calling it a Jew metal. Ford said, quote, whenever there's anything wrong with the country, you'll find the Jews on the job there. He blamed a vast and inchoate Jewish conspiracy for inciting his workers and his stockholders to demand that he share a sliver more of the expansive Ford Motor Company profits with them. He blamed them for the gold standard and for the advent of the Federal Reserve Bank and for ruining motion pictures and for ruining popular music and even for ruining baseball. Henry Ford was hardly the only radical anti-Semite in the United States circa 1920, but in addition to his fortune and his famous name and his iconic company, he had a megaphone your average crazy uncle theorizer lacked. He had a newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, which he purchased for a song in 1918. The paper was a big money loser in the beginning, not like $44 billion losing, but... Sorry. It had poor to middling circulation, and frankly, Ford's editorial harangues did little to draw new readers. How many attacks on the man who beat Ford in the most recent Michigan Senate race did the public really want to hear? Ford would say that Truman H. Newberry had stolen that election. One of the Dearborn Independent's editorial staffers, a veteran of the New York newspaper wars, had an idea. He wrote to Ford's right-hand man, quote, find an evil to attack. Let's find some sensationalism. And lo, the answer landed unbidden not long after, a newly translated English edition titled The Protocols of the Meetings of the Learned Elders of Zion. The pamphlet was the work of rabidly anti-Semitic Russian fabulists, furious at the Bolsheviks' toppling of the old Tsarist aristocracy. The Tsarists portrayed the Russian Revolution as not just a local affair, it was the early innings of a plot by a cabal of all-powerful Jewish schemers to take over the world. The Protocols was billed as the product of a surreptitious note-taker at a top-secret meeting where these Jewish puppet masters drew up their strategy and tactics in detail. There obviously was no such secret meeting, and there was no such secret plot. The whole thing was a work of fiction, a very considered, very deliberate lie, and a very dangerous piece of propaganda. Ford and his newspaper bore down on a new weekly series in the Dearborn Independent based on the Protocols. It would end up being a 92-part weekly series. Every week for nearly 2 years, it was headlines like these: "The International Jew, the World's Problem," and "Jewish Jazz, Moron Music, becomes our national music," and "The Perils of Baseball, Too Much Jew." These were the headlines splashed onto the pages of his newspaper, which was distributed in Ford Motor dealerships across the country. Ford also saw the publication of this foul series in book form. It was titled The International Jew, and it ran to 4 volumes. Never mind that the Protocols was exposed as total make-believe in 1921, which was somewhere right in the middle of Henry Ford's anti-Semitic screed of a 92-part newspaper series. Ford's weekly International Jew essays continued without pause, and Ford dealers kept tossing the latest issue of the Dearborn Independent onto the front seat of newly purchased Model Ts. Ford saw to it that the 4 volumes of the International Jew were translated and published worldwide in 12 international editions, including one in Germany. The German edition of Ford's book landed in the hands of one particularly gifted propagandist. When Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf was published in 1925, the author appeared to lift not just ideas, but whole passages from Henry Ford's publications. Mein Kampf's first edition extolled Henry Ford by name, singling him out for his steadfast courage in the face of ongoing assault by strikers or commies or bankers or media moguls or some combination thereof, Jews all, no doubt. Hitler wrote, "It is Jews who govern the stock exchange forces of the American Union. Every year makes them more and more the controlling masters, the producers in a nation of 120 millions. Only a single great man, Henry Ford, to their fury still maintains full independence." Hitler had already mulled sending some of his shock troops to major American cities to aid in Ford's possible run for president in 1924. When a reporter from the Detroit News showed up at Nazi Party headquarters in Munich in December 1931 to interview Hitler for her regular series, which was titled 5 Minutes with Men in Public Eye. That's exactly how it was phrased. She was surprised to find, hanging on the wall behind Hitler's desk, a large framed portrait of America's most famous anti-Semite. Hitler explained to the Detroit newspaper woman, quote, "I regard Henry Ford as my inspiration." The reporter asked Hitler that day point blank why he was anti-Semitic. He said without hesitation, "Somebody has to be blamed for our troubles." So in the 1930s, the international winds that put Germany in Hitler's hands and Italy in Mussolini's and Spain's and Franco's, that saw a fascist mob storm the French parliament and overthrow the elected government of France in 1934, that saw the British Union of Fascists formed in 1932. Those winds blew here too. And we had rabid anti-Semitism and pro-fascist agitation advanced by the most famous industrialist in the country, Henry Ford, and also by the most influential right-wing media figure this country has ever had to this day, Father Charles Coughlin. Also by America's consensus national hero, perhaps only the second most famous person in the country after the president himself, Charles Lindbergh. We also had the largest voluntary political organization in the country, the America First Committee, advocating against us joining the fight against Hitler and doing so in increasingly anti-Semitic terms. So these were among the most influential people in the whole country, and their work was accelerated by an aggressive effort by the German government to propagandize us, the American public. Propaganda telling us not to believe what they derided as atrocity stories about what the Nazis were doing. Propaganda telling us to see democracy as weak and corrupt and a failed project whose time had passed. We also had proliferating paramilitary groups who built and stockpiled bombs and plotted to overthrow the US government, in some cases with advice and support from the German government in Berlin. So, Prequel is about those dynamics at work, taking hold here to a surprising degree in the run-up to World War II. And I'll just say this one last thing. The reason this book is called Prequel is not because I believe we are dealing with some new iteration of Nazis or Hitler today. I do not believe that there is any analogy between anything in modern history and Germany under the Nazi Party and Hitler from 1933 to 1945. Only Hitler is Hitler, only Nazis are Nazis. This book is called Prequel not because of the bad guys in it, but because of the good guys in it. Because the story that I really wanted to tell, the reason I started this research and ended up doing the podcast about it, and I've now written a book about it, and I'm gonna do another series of the podcast, and I mean, the reason I can't let this story go is because from that era, Americans who fought Nazis and who fought Nazi operations here in America, who fought their fellow Americans who sided with the Nazis and had worked for the Nazi cause and tried to implement an American form of Nazism in this country, which happened. The Americans who fought all of that, I believe, gave us, in 2023, a gift. They left us stories and lessons for how to think about our challenges today. What are your options when an American ultra-right rises and starts agitating to end our system of government and to replace it with a strongman form of government instead? What are your options in particular when a movement like that isn't just agitating on the fringe? They have unnerving connections to elected politicians and to people with real political power. That's happening in our time. And it has happened in some other times too. But here in 2023, I think we sort of have to realize that this recurrent thing that happens in history has come for us. And for our descendants and for the next generations of Americans who come after us, what we do now is what they're going to look to learn from. And it's what they're going to learn about the character of us as a people in this time. What do you want to be able to brag about? What do you want to be able to tell people that you did in your country when you were here and alive while this was happening? I don't think it is a lucky thing to live in an important time, but we don't get to choose that, and this is an important time. So thank you for being here today, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Thank you. Look, it's Julian Zelizer. Look.
It's great to be here, and it's wonderful. Congrats on publishing this book. Congrats on the podcast, and congrats on bringing back this important story and doing it so well. You know, there was a time in the 1950s and 60s, historians used to write about a liberal consensus in America, and they said that there weren't extremes in this country, that most people agreed on the basics, individual rights and private property, and some lamented the absence of extremes, others just wrote about it, Richard Hofstadter and other historians. And then baby boomers recovered the history of the left and said there was actually a vibrant left in this country throughout much of the history, and they often influenced mainstream politics. This book, I think, and what you were working on, is part of a more recent kind of development to show there's also an extreme right that was not only there, but it had connections to mainstream American politics. So I just want to kind of set that as a framework for how I thought of the book. And I guess my first question is, why was there a foundation in the United States for fascism to take hold and even to find open ears on Capitol Hill?
The thing that I don't know the answer to is why we see it happen all over the world in waves. Like, I'm not a determinist who thinks like certain economic conditions lead people to want to get rid of democracy and have a strong man. Like, I don't think it's that simple. And even when there are widespread economic pressures that affect lots of democracies at once, democracies react so differently to those that I think it can't just be a single factor determinant thing like that. But I do also think that it's been eye-opening to me to realize this is a recurring problem in American history, that we did have a real problem. We had a big pro-fascist movement in this country in the lead up to World War II. I think also in the immediate post-war years, we had another important upsurge in it. I think obviously we're living through another upsurge of it now. Some of it, I think, is endemic to human nature. I mean, democracy at its heart, I mean, at the basic core dictionary definition is that we all get to say, we all get to decide together, that all of us citizens together get to use the democratic process to decide what happens in our country. That chafes, I think, for a lot of people at a lot of different times for a lot of different reasons. That there are, either you think you just ought to be in charge, or you think there's definitely some group among us that shouldn't get a say. And that impulse gets momentum and can be captured by the right or the wrong kind of leader. And it can also just find the wrong kind of audience at the wrong time. And I just think it's factors beyond me that I understand totally, but I do think that there's always sort of a germ of it, creating the tension for why democracy isn't self-sustaining.
And what did you get from some of the groups you look at, like the Christian Front and some of these organizations, from what you saw at least or heard? What was driving them from turning that idea or feeling into a kind of movement, into organizations?
Well, you see some of it in the modern right analogs to some of those groups. Like I was thinking about it with the Unite the Right Charlottesville rally, and the way that those various right-wing paramilitary and fascist, and in some cases neo-Nazi groups, talked about what they were doing there. And they used the existence of counter-protesters in Charlottesville as their sort of after-the-fact explanation for why they needed to be there in the first place. And you see that with the Christian Front, certainly. They wanted to set off a communist revolution so then they could be the vanguard of the anti-communist militia that would set in place a new fascist dictatorship in the United States. So there's something about fantasizing about your enemy, and that's why you see scapegoating of minority groups and elaborate conspiracy theories that disfavored groups aren't just bad, they're somehow secretly controlling everything. You need to, in a lot of these cases, they really do want to see themselves as patriots, and they want to see themselves as standing up against some existential threat to the country. And so they invent an existential threat through conspiracy theories and demagoguery that excuses what they want to do, which is take and hold power by force. And it's the same. I don't like articulating that, because I feel like once you realize that's the way it works, you kind of see how lots of people are playing with those things. But for me, it's also a little bit heartening to realize, oh, this is a tactical thing. This is the same thing they're doing over and over again. Who are you blaming now? Who's the cabal now? It does recur.
And everyone read the book. It's really, it's not only important, but it's a great read in terms of the narrative. But what do they do? So part of your story, and this was in the podcast, is literally transmitting information. But what were their ambitions, these groups? What was their goal?
Their goal was to, in some cases, I mean, this is going to sound crazy, but they really wanted a Hitler-style fascist dictator in the United States. So there's this group called the Silver Shirts, and at one level, they're completely ridiculous. They literally wear silver shirts that have a big Laverne and Shirley style L on them. L stands for Legion, because they were the Silver Legion. It's like absolutely ridiculous. Their leader was this guy who had otherworldly visions and had all of this occult nonsense. But there were tens of thousands of Americans who were part of this group. And one of the things that I write about in the book is Eric Sevareid, who was the great commentator for CBS News. Before he was Eric Sevareid, and he went by his full name, which was Arnold Sevareid, he was a cub reporter in Minneapolis, and he'd heard that these silver shirts were meeting like in middle-class homes and kind of respectable society in Minneapolis, and he got a tip about it, and he went out and he infiltrated the group, and he brought the story home to his editors, and they didn't believe him. And then one of his editors went out, and the editor came back and said, "Get me a drink. I've just seen the craziest thing I've ever seen in my life." But when they went to put it in the newspaper, they didn't know how to calibrate crazy versus dangerous. Is this just nutty, or is this really threatening? And I feel like in our time, we have learned that the answer to that is usually yes. And they were so rabidly anti-Semitic. They were so open in their embrace of crazy conspiracy theories and violence. And they were also armed to the teeth. They had connections inside US military armories. They had well-advanced plans, in some cases advised by the German consulate in California, to set off what might very well have put us into at least a state of emergency on the West Coast. And they thought if the country could be put into a state of emergency through effectively terroristic violence, then right-thinking Americans would rise up and kill the Jews, and we would have a war here between Gentiles and Jews, and the ultimate goal would be to oust Roosevelt, which is what they called Roosevelt and his Jew-infested administration, and instead put real Americans in there and rule by force. And they worked toward it. And it seems far-fetched and crazy, and they were also stockpiling, the groups like them and the Christian Front were stockpiling bombs and working toward really doing it.
And were they, before the late 30s, were there politicians who were listening? Did they have connections to, people on the Hill? As in the South, you see it all in a state like Mississippi, the line between legislator, governor, and Klan often was direct. Did you find some of that or see some of that with these groups?
Yes, and it continues for a long time. I mean, it starts in the early 30s, really, with the origin of these groups, and it continues right through the 50s and right into the early 60s even. And it is a lot of Deep South pro-segregation legislators. White supremacy and fascism are not just cousins, they're incestuously involved. But it's also, one of the, I think the worst actors in terms of perverting the American system in favor of defending and coddling these folks was a Democratic senator from Montana, Senator Burton Wheeler, who did a lot of great things in his career as well, but who personally inveigled himself into the Justice Department and got 2 successive prosecutors fired who were leading investigations of these violent ultra-fascist movements. And he got it done because he wanted to protect himself, because he was implicated in some of what they were doing. And so there's that closeness to people who aren't just fringy figures in politics, but are people with real power, to me is the part that made me sort of stop what I thought I was doing and decide to tell this story before I did anything else.
And I think that's central to a lot of the book and the podcast, that connection. It's jarring once you see. You can not understand, but you could see these kinds of groups existing in America. But what you do well is then say, well, here's the tie to people with real power.
Yes.
And I think that changes the story, little like in our current times, but I think it's a very important part of it.
I grew up in the 80s and 90s in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we had white Aryan resistance and Aryan nations and all of these other racist skinhead groups. And they had a presence in my town. Some of the first activism I ever did was trying to get anti-racist skinheads to go beat up racist skinheads. It's like trying to be a crossing guard for those types of interactions. But what was, even though I grew up very aware of that and actually aware of, active Klan chapters and things like this, it always felt both dangerous and very, very fringe. Mm-hmm. And now I'm 50, and you've got members of Congress who are speaking at the Nick Fuentes America First, where'd you get that name, conference, where they're literally shouting Hitler's name. And you've got sitting members of Congress there, and then they stay on their committee assignments, and they stay in Congress doing it. And so I think that's an important way that we can calibrate danger, is radicalism, but also reach, and radicalism and access to real power. And when those things come together, I mean, Father Coughlin, if he had been doing a YouTube show from his basement, would not have been a historical figure. But Father Coughlin doing what he was doing, saying, I take the fascist road, we need the Franco way in this country, we need to get a dictator in there by force of bullets, and saying what he said about Jews in America, him doing that while reaching 30 million Americans every week on his radio show at a time when we didn't have 200 million people in this country. I mean, it's the combination of radicalism and reach, radicalism and access to power. That's the kindling and the tinder and the fuel altogether.
And maybe you can just, before we get into some more detail, how did you find all this? Meaning, you're recovering the history of people who by nature are secret. They're not putting their papers in the Library of Congress. So how do you find the story? How did you uncover this?
So I was interested just from my work in the news and talking about what's going on in our country today. I found myself kind of stymied on a thing that I was repeatedly covering that I didn't know how to explain, which was the simultaneous rise of this form of American ultra-right politics that we've got right now, and the new visibility and new volume of Holocaust denial. Really old school, unreconstructed Holocaust denial in a way that I think of as absurd. I mean, Holocaust denial is a lot of things and it functions a lot of ways, but it's also just nuts. It's crazy. And I was trying to figure out whether there's a relationship between these things or how you could talk about the relationship between these things, and I didn't think it was going to be a very long answer. But I ended up back in the immediate post-war years looking at the first Americans to articulate the denial of the Holocaust, which happens as early as 1948. Which is, I mean, you think about the number of Americans, just GIs, don't even think about refugees, just GIs who had been there and seen with their own eyes, to have people in 1948 saying it didn't happen. How is that? Well, it's because they needed to be able to say that for a political project that was live for them at the time. And when I learned that that political project involved a whole lot of Americans, that got me to the Great Sedition Trial of 1944. And we were just talking about this backstage, but one of the things that I have found that's been really interesting, and I think it's been like one of God's little personal challenges for me, is that when it comes to looking at not primary source material like transcripts and direct archives and stuff, but secondary source material, anybody else writing about this history, writing about this time, doing any analysis of it, everything that existed about this thing that I have written about was all from the far right. Because they were the only people who wanted to remember this history. They remember these as their glory days, when they had Charles Lindbergh and Henry Ford and Charles Coughlin and the America First Committee, the biggest political organization in the country. And they had tens of thousands of people in the silver shirts, and they had the Christian Front, and they all got off in their sedition trial. And the very far right is the only sort of part strata in our society that has tried to keep this history alive. And I don't trust their telling of it, so I've used a lot of that material, but tried to figure out the real truth myself. And it's been weird to talk to so many historians who say, I never knew this, I teach this era and I didn't know about this. But I think it's in part because this is something that it feels more comfortable to tell us a neater, cleaner black and white story about World War II and where the good guys were and where the bad guys were.
And maybe I'm curious how you do it, meaning 2 weeks ago I interviewed like this. I was interviewing Robert Caro, and he went through a lot of his techniques of, kind of turn every page in the archives and the interviews he does. And you are a reporter, an interviewer, a host, and here you're kind of moving into writing great history. And recording history. How do you do it? Do you have a process? Do you have methods you use?
No.
None.
One of the things that happened when I changed my schedule at MSNBC, again, thank you, boss, is that I thought I would get a little more time to not work, and that hasn't happened. But I do also feel like I don't, doing a 5-day-a-week primetime cable news show just means you have to like stay in third gear at 5,000 RPMs all the time, which is a great way to end your engine life sooner than you otherwise should. And so I'm not doing that. But I don't work any fewer hours. I just work on different things. And I find myself really, as I'm more and more alienated from what social media is right now, I am finding mental health in just reading book-length treatments of things. Like, it just helps to read, to nurture your attention span, to read things that take longer to understand. It's good for you, and it's been good for me. And so my office is a little shop of horrors in terms of what I've been reading, but I just read all the time and talk to all the people that I can. And even though the bad guys are in secretive organizations didn't put their archives in the Library of Congress, you find weird archives in the weirdest places.
Such as?
So, well, like, I have recently stumbled upon a treasure trove of super secretive bad guy's papers who didn't want anybody to know anything that he had ever done in life. And one of his correspondents saved everything the guy ever sent him, and then like kind of sweet talked his sweet little simple-minded widow into giving him all his stuff after the guy was dead. And then his friend put his papers at Yale. And so I don't know, like I do feel like there's little corners you can get around sometimes in terms of what people wanted to be known about them. There's also some great stories behind that stuff. And one of the stories we told in Ultra, which we tell, which I tell sort of in a different way in the book, is about Senator Ernest Lundin and his wife Norma desperately trying to make sure that his correspondence with a Nazi spy did not end up in his official papers. And she took them and brought them home, and when she was subpoenaed and told to produce them in a court proceeding when that Nazi spy was on trial for being a Nazi spy, she said that they had been burgled. And they are not burgled. She forgot to tell her kids that these have been burgled. Definitely don't let Dad's papers in this file be seen. And so they're in their family archives, which is freaking fantastic.
Was there, when you were reading at the beginning, I was back there, you read about Henry Ford,
yeah,
who, I think when people hear what he wrote, it's stunning how horrible it was. And here's this major automaker who we still kind of revere, and you read his publications, and Father Coughlin, obviously this massive radio or media personality. I mean, how did people react to this? Was it just, oh yeah, there's Ford being Ford, or I've heard that radio show, or was there contention over this kind of stuff being said in public?
There was contention about it, which is heartening. I mean, the thing to me that was revelatory about Ford is I feel like I knew, like I drive a Ford, like I had felt guilty about the fact that Ford was an anti-Semite, but I sort of thought that he was a private anti-Semite. I didn't realize that he was the most prolific spreader of anti-Semitic propaganda in the English language in the history of the world. He had an impact in the United States. He had an impact on Hitler. I mean, and it's not just Hitler himself. I mean, the head of the Hitler Youth ascribes his, for lack of a better term, red pilling, his awakening to the great truth of anti-Semitism as having read Ford's publications. The head of the Hitler Youth, for what it's worth, not only was the head of the Hitler Youth, he also survived the end of the war and tried to lead one of the first Nazi return to power plots in Germany in the post-war years. So it's not just learning about them as celebrities and figures, it's about learning about their impact is the thing that kind of shocked me. But I'm also, I said that it's called Prequel in part because of the good guys. I mean, one of the things I'll just say about Henry Ford is that prominent public figures such as Woodrow Wilson, Clarence Darrow, W.E.B. Du Bois, William Jennings Bryan joined the fight against Ford's anti-Semitism, calling Ford's vile utterings un-American and un-Christian. The former president, William Howard Taft, soon to be named Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, accepted a speaking engagement at an anti-defamation league in Chicago 2 days before Christmas 1920 and used that speech to lambaste Ford and his assertions about a powerful Jewish conspiracy stripping power from Christians around the world. Taft said from this incredibly influential position, as he's about to become Chief Justice, he says, quote, "There is not the slightest ground for anti-Semitism among us. It has no place in free America." Whatever else you think about President Taft, okay, thanks, that was helpful. And the Americans, famous and not, who tried to undermine the influence of these folks, the people who stood up and interrupted the America First rallies and who argued against Lindbergh and who, honestly, the Catholic Church leaders who let Coughlin out on this long leash for all of these years. And then finally, after the bishop who had most protected him died and got out of the way, decided that he could not organize his listeners into armed militia groups to pursue a fascist overthrow of the US government in the name of the Catholic Church anymore, and decided to finally pull him off the air and say, you're going back to being a parish priest. It took a while, but yeah, okay, good. Let's tell that story too and learn about those. Yeah. All sorts of institutions need to do all sorts of different things.
And that's important. I mean, it's important both to recover the heroes, to recover the anti-fascists, but also to see these things were contested at the time. I mean, there's this narrative you hear all the time. It often is like with the monument debates, or naming that no one knew at the time. You're kind of retrospectively putting values on what people thought back then, and rarely is that true.
Yes.
And kind of the stories you tell here show this was fraught, and people understood the dangers when this was public of what was being said.
And some of the people who understood the danger were inside the government. Like, there were these efforts at prosecuting some of these guys. William Dudley Pelley, the Silver Shirts guy, did spend most of World War II in prison. But a lot of the people who recognized the danger were outside of government because they were working at the ADL, or because, in one case, one of the great heroes of this book is a guy who was an expert in direct mail, which obviously is what all American heroes are born into, right? Raise your child to be a direct mail advertising executive. He was a junk mail guy, but he was an expert in the field. He had a trade publication, and his son went off to the University of Pennsylvania and started getting propagandized, started getting leaflets and flyers and publications under his door at Penn. And he said, "Dad, what's this about?" And Dad, as an expert in the field of direct mail, said, "I know how to trace these things to their origin." And he, from his weird civilian position of expert knowledge, was able to unravel a nationwide, multi-million-dollar ongoing government effort directed from Berlin to propagandize the American people in this country using the US Congress and 24 senators and members of Congress to do it. And he just figured it out as a civilian observer who was concerned, and he raised holy hell, and he was threatened and had to move his family and had to deal with all sorts of blowback for it. He never got famous for it. His obituary didn't mention any of it. But he did it, and we owe him a debt of gratitude, and he ought to be famous. So his name is Henry Hoke, and I'm trying to make him famous.
And where was law enforcement? I mean, you talk about the FBI and the people who should be cracking down on these organizations. Where were they as this was unfolding?
Sometimes they were investigating these guys. But most of the time, what was going on with federal law enforcement in particular was eyes left. It was that they were concerned about the communist menace and the idea of an ultra-right either didn't seem dangerous or didn't seem wrong. One of the major heroes in this story, and his story is told best actually in another book by a historian named Stephen Ross, the book called Hitler in Los Angeles. He found the papers of Leon Lewis, who in Southern California, as a World War I veteran, recruited fellow World War I veterans, who in large part were not Jewish, they were mostly German Americans, to go infiltrate Nazi groups in Southern California, find out what they were doing, and then produce written reports, spy reports. And Stephen Ross, I had dinner with him last night, is the one who dug up the spy reports from Leon Lewis's operation and then pieced them together with things from other archives that allowed him to decode them and figure out what they were about. Leon Lewis actually had done a lot of it in literal code because the Nazis also knew where his office was and they were constantly breaking in, threatening him. So everything had to have no names on it and it was all numbers and codes and things. But Stephen decoded it, and what we ended up with Leon Lewis was the story of incredible bravery, infiltrating these groups, writing it up, and then providing the information to law enforcement. And there's this scene in Southern California and San Diego where they have discovered something really bad that the silver shirts and people working with them were going to do in San Diego. And they brought it to San Diego's sheriff at the time, and he sat there and told Leon Lewis to his face how much he agreed with those guys. And how Jews were communists and communists were Jews, and the more of them that ended up dead, the better the country would be. And so Leon Lewis knew what he was up against and knew that couldn't be the end of it. And so he took it to military intelligence. And Army intelligence blew him off. And the FBI blew him off repeatedly for years. Ultimately, there was one guy in Navy intelligence on the West Coast who liked Leon Lewis and recognized that Leon Lewis had helped him lock up a couple of US Marines who had been stealing US military weapons and giving them to the silver shirts, and respected Leon Lewis for what he had done. That was a successful court-martial with Leon's evidence. And he listened. And naval intelligence, of all things, because of one brave leader there, was willing to follow those tips and see where they went. And that was enough of a hold in, somebody with real power to be able to pursue it. Ultimately, very late in the game, the FBI took advantage, well into World War II, took advantage of Leon Lewis's spy files and used it in the Great Sedition Trial of 1944, but not until he'd been, for more than a decade, doing that work alone. And again, Leon Lewis died a completely anonymous figure in American history. None of this was in his obituary. There's no monument to him anywhere. And he did work that I feel like I'm going to be studying for 10 years in terms of what it offers us today, in terms of bravery, but also tactical genius.
Why didn't, it's just, and I want to get back to the heroes, but you called them earlier, I think you said pro-fascists, yeah. And then the silver shirts, the country gentlemen, they call themselves, those are the terms they're using. Why were they hiding what they were about? Was it for fear of law, or are they somehow aware this is not the right thing to do?
Well, they're in their propaganda. Yeah. And like if you read the Silver Legion newsletter, I don't recommend doing it late in the day if you value your sleep, but it's if you read what they were circulating to try to agitate for their cause and try to recruit people, they're not hiding their light under a bushel at all. They're being as overt as you can possibly imagine. They're talking about, the gutters running with the blood of the Jews, and they're, it's, and they're willing to be as vile as you want in those kind of communications. But when it comes to identifying themselves and giving a name to themselves and describing who they are, they want to be seen as patriots. Gerald L.K. Smith, he is the origin of the term, or he's the popularizer of the term Christian nationalism. and his newsletter was called The Cross and the Flag. And one of the taglines, which I had to fight with the copy editors about at my publisher, that William Dudley Pelley and his group use is, "Let's be fanatically American," because it doesn't sound right. How do you, fanatic doesn't sound good, but this idea that being an ultra patriot means being anti-Semitic and being willing to put America in the hands of a strong man who will not tether us to this democratic process, which is weakening us and giving bad people and the wrong people a say in who we are. And that's the appeal, right? That's ultimately why this is a recurring thing. Democracy means everybody gets a say through the democratic process. If you have been led to believe that some people are a cabal that is out to secretly control the world and destroy you and is manipulating everything, well, you don't want them participating in a process with you. And if you have been led to believe that the democratic process doesn't really work, and that your vote doesn't count, and that elections are rigged, and that even if your vote is counted, it doesn't actually determine what happens in government anyway, because government is controlled by a secret cabal, and none of us can ever penetrate that, and the democratic process is a farce, well, then you're going to be very much willing to give up your democratic process in favor of somebody who can just get things done. And if you are in a country where there are violent paramilitary or just intimidating street gang groups that are associated with certain political factions, well then your participation in the political process is going to be determined by how physically strong you are, or how brave you are, or how much danger you're willing to put yourself and your kids in. Well, that's a political process that gets very small very quickly. And so all these dynamics at work all are functional. It's not just a cancer that shows that there's bad people around us that get more or less powerful over time, or that are better or more poorly led over time. It's about the tactical needs of those who want democracy to end. And they use the same tactics over and over again. And you just watch for these things. In democracies all over the world, you watch for violence in the political sphere. You watch for scapegoating and conspiracy theories. You watch for the strength of the democratic process. You watch for the assault on truth. Don't believe journalists. Don't believe scientists. Don't believe experts. Don't believe factual information about the world. Don't attach yourself to real problems and practical solutions. Instead, just go with your gut, go with your prejudices, go with what the leader tells you is right. Those four things, when those four cornerstones, when any of them starts getting wiggly, sort of heads up, but when all of them start getting wiggly, when all of them start getting rattled by forces who are trying to do away with democracy, we need to do something. Those things need to be shored up. And you can see it in other countries, both in history and contemporaneously around the world today. And you can see it in our own history in a way that we haven't been willing to talk about, I think, before now.
Can you tell us one of the stories I found in this Confessions of a Nazi Spy?
Yeah, it's
can
fantastic.
Can you share a little bit about that?
So Confessions of a Nazi Spy, you can stream it tonight when you go home. It's 1939, Warner Brothers. So there was a censor in Hollywood. It wasn't just the code about, how racy you could be. There was also a code in Hollywood that said that you couldn't criticize any other country or its government. And the guy who enforced the code meant Germany when he said, when it came to enforcing that. And there was a real strict rule, even as Hitler had done a lot to bring himself to the world's attention, that said that Hollywood couldn't portray him in any light that the Germans themselves might not enjoy. And the way that Warner Brothers got around it in 1939 is they said, all right, well, we're going to do this as a feature, but it's going to be all true. And there had been a group of Nazi spies sent over from Germany who were busted by the FBI. And while they were on trial for trying to enact a bunch of really dramatic sabotage in the United States, Warner Brothers sent a screenwriter to go sit in their trial and take notes. and he used the facts of the trial to write his screenplay, which hewed directly, word for word, to what had happened in real life. And that gave Warner Brothers the opportunity to tell the censor, like, yeah, we know you don't want us to opine against Germany, but in this case, dude, I'm reading your book. Like, I'm quoting your own words back to you. This is something that has happened in real life, and it's not us taking editorial license. And they produced this melodramatic but great movie called Confessions of a Nazi Spy, every word of which is true. And you look at it and you think it's crazy. Really, there was an old lady in Scotland who was the mail drop for the German spies all over the world, and they were all sending their communication through her? Yes, there was actually an old lady in Scotland. And some of the speeches between the G-men and their betters, and some of the language that is quoted from the spies is direct from FBI intercepts and direct from G-men testimony during the trial. And so that truth was how they got around the censor. And it was such a sensation, the movie, that it broke the rule. And after Confessions of a Nazi Spy came out, in a year that a lot of other good movies came out, 1939 was a good year, it essentially unshackled Hollywood, and they started doing critical movies about Hitler and about fascism and what was going on in Europe. And that, I think, may have had an underappreciated and important role in turning America toward interventionism at a time when we were really otherwise not inclined that way.
And one of the figures who's important is Drew Pearson, who's a journalist, and he uncovers the Lundin story, I believe. He's one of the first to write about it. He was a big kind of muckraker columnist at the time. A lot of politics. Lyndon Johnson hated him.
Every president.
Right, they all just. But he uncovers a lot of stories. Can you, kind of in the world of journalism, you've talked about a little bit about prosecutors in journalism, either him or anyone else who was doing the work to bring this to the public.
So Pearson is a very powerful, very influential, very controversial columnist. Everybody hates him. But he's an investigative columnist, effectively, and he breaks scoops all the time. And so when Senator Ernest Lundin is killed in a mysterious plane crash in August 1940, it is Drew Pearson who breaks the news that he had been under investigation by the Justice Department for his dealings with a Nazi spy. There had been a left-wing tabloid in New York, a magazine called PM, which itself has an amazing history. And PM had reported 2 weeks before Lundin went down in that plane crash that there was something going on in Congress. And there was a Nazi spy who was involved with a number of members of Congress, and the Justice Department was just onto this story. And we know, actually, from telegrams between the German embassy in Washington and headquarters back in Berlin, that the Germans were freaking out about the fact that this was about to be exposed. And so that creates all of this drama, still unresolved drama, around what exactly was going on with that plane crash. We still don't know why that plane crashed. It might have been lightning, it might have been sabotage, we don't know. But in fact, there were a number of Justice Department personnel on that plane. In fact, even though the Justice Department denied it at the time, they were surveilling Senator Lundin at the time because of his ties to this Nazi spy. And in fact, the Nazis were freaking the flick out about the fact that this was about to be exposed, and they believed that Senator Lundin did not have the strength of character to keep his mouth shut about it. So Drew Pearson cracks that open for the country. He also breaks a lot of these stories. He's the one from whom we first learn about Senator Wheeler intervening to get the first prosecutor fired in the sedition trial. And like I said, he was a controversial guy, and everybody went crazy over the way that he reported everything, and he made every enemy in the world. But I think he also had something like 140 libel suits brought against him in the course of his career, and he ended up settling one on a technicality, and all the rest of them he won.
We're going to be out of time, but I want to ask you, one of the things I really appreciate of what you're doing is your translation of history to a broader audience, which is hard to do. Certainly historians, we wrestle with it all the time. Some do it, some don't. But you've managed to now with Bagman and this kind of bring very serious, hard-hitting subjects, corruption scandal, fascism, anti-Semitism, and you've done it in ways that are very accessible. People ask me, have you heard this, who are not heavy-duty history readers. So I guess my question is twofold. One, how do you think of doing it? How do you think of making that translation and making it accessible? And I'm curious, back to what I asked earlier, is there a connection with the opening of your show that you would do when you would tell a narrative? And I'm sure everyone here loves those. And how you think of then taking a complex story and telling it to us.
Yeah, I'm like a simple creature. And the thing that I get dinged for, I mean, what you're describing in terms of the way the show starts, you either love that or you don't. And there's plenty of people who don't love that. But
I think they love it.
That's why you're here. It's great. Thank you. And some people, that form of sort of storytelling works, and I respect that not everybody wants to hear about that. But it's true in my personal life, too. I mean, Susan will tell you, like, did something, you said you had some story to tell me about something that happened in the parking lot of the supermarket today. And I'll be like, okay, yeah, so first there were dinosaurs, and then there was an asteroid, and then, no, just skip to the part where you went to Stop and Shop. Yeah. I have a problem that way, which just means I'm no fun at like a party. But if your brain works at all like mine, where you like to go back to the beginning to understand where something came from or understand why something is important, then hopefully this history feels as accessible to you as it does feel compelling to me. I mean, I'm not a historian, and I'm doing everything I can to try to credit the real historians who deserve more attention and more accolades for the pieces of this that they've dug up too. But for me, this is just how I learn. Like, I wanted to get to that Holocaust denial question, and I think I'm getting close to it, which is why I'm working on a new project that's an offshoot of this now. But without confidence, I think, in the origins of some of these things, you end up saying the wrong thing. You end up calling something unprecedented when it's not. Or you end up asking the wrong kind of expert. Or you end up being insensitive to somebody directly involved in it who you're talking to because you don't understand that this is not the first time that their extended family has gone through a fight like this. And so I always say to everybody, anybody who's in the news business, anybody who's in the cable news business, like the one piece of advice I have for you in this business is to read widely. Don't just read today's news. Some days you have to. Some days all you can do is keep up with the latest breaking thing. But anytime you have any other moment, read outside the lines and try to read stuff that takes a longer attention span. Context for me is everything. And so I have always believed that you can bring anybody from sort of zero to grad student level understanding of anything as long as you start in kindergarten. Like, let's just start with basic stuff that we all know. And I believe that if you talk to people like adults, President Obama used to say this in a way that really resonated with me, that people can handle really complex stuff and subtle stuff and stuff with important nuances as long as you're willing to go on the whole journey with them. And start people with what they know. And we're adults, and we can handle it, and we all bring different types of life experience and learning to bear on all of these things. But I believe that you can talk about civilian-military relations, which is my first book, and the politics that attend to extractive industries like the oil and gas industries, which was my book Blowout. And I believe that we can talk about Americans contending with fascism and pro-fascist movements here at home in a way that also includes dumb jokes and crazy characters and amazing anecdotes and stuff that might draw you in. And I don't think that's a weakness. It's just the way that I think. And I hope that it works for other people too, because I think it's important stuff.
And assuming they won't turn the lights out, I am going to ask one follow-up. From your journalism to the different podcasts and books you've written, and I'm going to include you in the not only Journalists but Historians Club. You are now a member. Not that I have authority to do it, but
Don't tell the other historians.
If I were to ask you, kind of, are there 2 or 3 questions in all of this that really animate you in terms of what you want to understand about this country? From your monologues to your books, what are the questions that really get to the core of who you are as a public figure?
Questions about me or
No,
questions about the world?
country. About the country.
That's a deep question. I think one of them is what I was trying to just describe about my faith in people to absorb complexity and depth, to understand things in a deep and true way, and to act on moral imperatives. Like, I believe that. I am not the world's sunniest person. You can probably tell from the kinds of topics that I'm interested in. But I actually am interested in them because I do think that when we learn it, we make the right decisions. And I kind of have to believe that, but I do believe it. And for example, just something from the book, one of the reasons that I'm so concerned about efforts right now to make people not believe in democracy, that one of those 4 cornerstones I was talking about, is because one of the things that really did work in the 1940s is that when people like Henry Hoke and people like Drew Pearson and and people like Leon Lewis and people at the Justice Department did expose this stuff, the people who were in power, who were the really dangerous connections between these crazy fascist violent groups and real American political power, they all got voted out of office. When they were exposed and people learned what they were doing, there was a reaction, and people who had been in office for 24, 26 years got voted out. Hamilton Fish had never lost an election in his life and never planned on it until he, in the context of the Great Sedition trial, had somebody come up and run against him who ran entirely on the basis of his Nazi connections. And it was not like they were new, but they were newly known. And the American people and the people of his district who had been willing to put him back there again and again and again said no. And they did the same thing to Burton Wheeler. And they did the same thing to Gerald Nye. And they did the same thing to Robert Rice Reynolds. And they did the same thing to Jacob Thorkelson. And they did the same thing to one after another of these guys. And Senator Rush Holt and Congressman Stephen Day. And they just got voted out. And Norma Lundin, Senator Lundin's widow, who stole the Viereck file, she tried to run for his seat. And Minneapolis was like, no, we're not going to do it. And that is like, I believe that we will make the right call when we have the right information. And I believe that we are able to absorb incredible amounts of even dark, even complex information. And that is what I'm trying to help with.
Thank you for that answer. That was good. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thanks to this wonderful institution for hosting us. And Rachel Maddow, thank you and congratulations.